今日はメルカリのエンジニアリング部門の VP がリーダーシップについて教えてくれるそうだけど、どんな話でしょうか。
Hey,
こんにちは。
sorry to keep you waiting. So today, I know I promised you I'm going to talk to you a little bit about leadership, and actually I'm planning to use this. Do you know what is this?
ダンジョンズ&ドラゴンズ。
Yeah,
リーダーシップと何の関係があるの？
well, you will discover soon enough.
いいですね。聞かせてください。現在はメルカリの VP オブエンジニアリングを務めているキャッツ。そして驚くべきもう一つの一面、なんと30年近くダンジョンズ&ドラゴンズのダンジョンマスターとして物語を紡ぎ続けてきたのです。
So what is Dungeons and Dragons? So it's a tabletop role-playing game in which you get together with your friends and you sort of like start creating stories together. So imagine that it's kind of like a movie, one of these like fantasy medieval movies, in particular in Dungeons and Dragons settings, in which there will be a set of heroes, in this case your players, and you will be giving them like quests, challenges, an unfinished script for a movie that we build together while we play. And I forgot to mention an important role, which is what we call the game master or the dungeon master, which is ultimately the person that creates the adventure or the framework within the adventure happens. And it's kind of a very hard role to play in the sense that you need to react a lot to what your players are doing. You need to design kind of a set of adventures and the outcome.
ダンジョンマスターがリーダーシップとリンクしているわけですね。
The more time I spend acting as a dungeon master, I realized that some of the skills that I get to use these days as a manager, as an engineering leader, are kind of related. I tap into the same kind of skill set, and throughout the time, I sort of developed these kind of like leadership principles that I learned while playing Dungeons and Dragons that I will explain later.
では、リーダーシップの原則を教えてください。
Where do we start? So, whether you are playing, preparing a campaign or a game, or you are actually starting a big project, the first principle that I find is important for me is the planning. Early in my career as a manager, as every other manager, some of our projects didn't went well. We failed at achieving what we were trying to do. And what I realized after doing like some retrospective is I never did proper planning. If I were to put this in terms of Dungeons and Dragons, I send my adventures to a dungeon without explaining, without giving them a map, without explaining or thinking about what is going to be inside this dungeon, who created this dungeon, so that when they actually explore and ask questions, I'm ready to provide answer. So it's the same when you're planning a project, when you're rallying around a team, you need to give your members context about why we are building this, what comes after the first stage, and be able to give them enough context for them to understand and take actions within the project itself. So that's why, for me, planning is kind of one of the key principles, whether you are building, again, a campaign or when preparing for a new quarter's list of projects.
なるほど。で、次の原則は？
Alright, so we are going to create a game. It's more than a game itself, it's a visual novel. And for this, we are going to use a framework that is called Mercari. This is an open source framework. It's specialized for building this kind of games.
ゲームを作りながらリーダーシップの原則を教えてくれるのですね。
It's very simple to pick up, and actually it's quite fun to work with. Mercari is kind of a subset of Python, so if you know Python, you will probably be catching up very quickly. And this framework is it's kind of a conversational engine, but also allows us to inject or add images. Now we are going to fill this with interesting information, and for that we are going to use Gemini. And I'm going to ask Gemini to to give me a script about the game. The story that I would like to port into the game is part of the campaign that I'm playing right now, which is the players start by investigating a murder in a medieval city called Castella. This is the capital of the kingdom of Castell, and there is a lot of kind of shady things going on there. And the idea of this is, through this initial investigation, the player will start discovering the different factions, the different powers that are moving things around, and finally the end goal is to discover like the main villain, which is the leader of a cult called the Crimson Club. So the idea is, it came with text that is natural for me to read, but it is difficult for an AI to actually leverage this to generate code, so I'm asking it to provide a different format. This is going to be a more structured way of presenting the same information, and I'm going to copy this. So now I'm going to start preparing, and I'm going to be using, as you can see here, this is my editor, Visual Studio Code. I'm going to use Cloud Code to generate part of the code that we will be using throughout the game. While we wait, actually, this is a good cue, because my second principle, one that I use the most, is actually improvisation. When things doesn't work according to the plan, or when you need to switch into direction. And this ties to the previous principle. Doesn't matter how deeply you plan, how detailed your plan is, things might not go as planned. There might be some additional costs that you were not contemplating, and suddenly you need to rely on a different technology stack. There might be a third-party tool that you were depending on, and suddenly that is no longer available because it's been a security breach and you need to pivot to a different tool, and that affects all the planning that you have done before. For me, this skill of being able to react to unforeseen circumstances is key, because you need to still keep your organization and projects running. And funny enough, this is a skill that I really developed thanks to being a dungeon master for many years. So we have here some code that Claude has been creating for us. So for example, if we go to, this is the main script that until now was empty, but this already generating a little bit of the game components. For example, we have the first act here. It's already creating some of the transitions that it will actually become the different animations that we will see in the game. And for image generation, I'm going to be relying on Midjourney. This is a very popular Gen AI tool for creating images. And as you can see, I use it a lot, not only for today, but for all the work that I do in my campaigns. So now, after some fixes, improvising, we have already the first screen. As you can see, the background is the one that we have generated, and now we need to create like these two characters. When I go back to the code here, it will be these two characters. Early morning, We have two characters. One is called Elias and one is called Anya. And these two are going to have this conversation. In Ren'Py, it's pretty simple. We will write the kind of conversation that they will have. And in some cases, we will create a menu with a different dialogue that they might have, and based on those dialogue, we will create the story. And since we are talking about dialogues and keeping story, that ties together to the next principle that I find, the third principle, which is keep things moving. When you finish a project, or when you finish a milestone, it's always important as a leader to know what comes next, to make sure that things are going in the right flow. And obviously, you keep relying on the previous principles. Do the right planning when you start a new milestone, or when you glue you connect different phases of projects or different initiatives. Each time, I always go back to planning, improvising when things doesn't go according to what you expect, but make sure that you know what is coming next. That way, you keep things running, you keep things moving, and you get these learnings based on what you are discovering. You celebrate small victories, you celebrate small wins when you achieve a milestone, when you release on time. You celebrate, you plan, you take a break, you think what is coming next, and you make sure that your team is ready for the next leg of the journey. All right, so we need to create these two characters. Again, I'm going to switch to Midjourney to try to create the silhouettes for these characters. This is much more like fantasy, dark fantasy-like. It might work quite well for the game itself. Just for the sake of simplicity, let's see what it generates and pick a couple of them, and we will be making these pictures ready for the game. One of the important things for these kind of games is the dialogue, the kind of conversation that will help the players to explore the world and start taking decisions. And when you write on thinking in terms of this dialogue, one important thing is creating a consistent narrative, an interesting story to tell your players. And this connects to my fourth leadership principle, which is create a narrative. The reason for this, what I realized throughout my experience as a manager, I tend to rely a lot early on data and create all the necessary data points to convey my point. I found throughout my experience as a manager that when I try to get people behind an idea, data is important, but you need to glue this together with a nice narrative. And again, making use of my experience building this kind of story-driven experiences for my players, I found that this skill of being able to create narrative around ideas, it helps to convey the idea, it helps to get buy-in, and it helps to connect your ideas, your vision, what you want to achieve, into something that people can not only understand the data itself, but actually have an emotional connection with. So this is another of the principles that I use a lot in my daily interactions. Then we keep doing dialogue. So for example, let's say, so this dialogue seems to be interesting, but actually I would like to have a little bit more of interaction between the initial characters, because this is how people are going to start understanding who these characters are. If I go back here and let me go back, rewind a little bit and see if I can get the new dialogue options. The way in which these two initial characters is going to interact is a little bit probably deeper than before. One thing that I believe we need next is probably start like having a little bit of sounds, a little bit of music, having some background music. It helps with the immersion.
ということで音楽はテーブルトップオーディオっていうサイトから引っ張ってきます。
We are using different tools, and this connects to the fifth principle, which is wearing different hats. Sometimes you're focusing, when you are a dungeon master, sometimes you're focusing on creating the script, sometimes you're focusing on drawing maps, sometimes you're focusing on creating images that you're going to be using as handouts for your players to use, meaning that you need to be able to shift between different tasks while you are managing a game session. The same way when it comes to leader and being able to not being fixed with one specific role, but being able to wear different hats is another skill that I believe is quite important to develop as a leader. Sometimes you are going to be acting as a mentor for a member that needs some additional support. Sometimes you are going to be acting as a coach for a member that already knows what she or he needs to do. You just need to figure it out by themselves. Sometimes you are going to be negotiating scope or timelines with the counterpart, etc., outside your team. Sometimes you will need to act as a mediator or eventually figuring out what needs to be done for your team to be successful. So another of the leadership principles that I believe is important is to some extent flexibility, being able to wear or execute different roles, regardless of your actual assignment and title. All right, so going back to our game here, we already have the backgrounds, we have some interesting dialogue going on here, but now it's time to discover, when there is a hero, it has to be the evil person, right? Every good story has a villain, like some of the best stories, even in the pop culture, Star Wars or any other, they do have very charismatic villains, and now it's time for us to create our villain for this story. So I'm going to create a hybrid between a human and a dragon that is going to be behind the scene, moving things around. And while I create, and going back to Midjourney, I'm going to generate the image for this. And now we go to the next principle, principle number 6. And actually this is one principle that it took me a while to fully understand, especially early on in my career. I wanted to be kind of like the good guy always, be there for my team, be this understanding leader that ultimately protects the team members. But also I realized, like, in some cases, it's unavoidable to be the bad guy. Sometimes as a manager, as a leader, throughout your career, you are going to be required to make a hard decision. This might be related to a project that the team really wants to get in production, but company priorities change and you have to stop it. And ultimately, you convey the point, not only making use of data, but also making use of the narrative to guide your team through the decision. And again, going back to planning, reacting to changing circumstances, keep things moving to make sure that ultimately the team regains focus and focuses on the next important task at hand. And that's also why villains in the stories, whether it's a movie or especially when you're playing a Dungeons and Dragons game, is a key component because the heroes need to have somebody to beat. As a dungeon master, you will be playing monsters or villains most of the time. But ultimately, being comfortable playing the role of a hero or a villain, being the bad guy is an important skill to develop because throughout your career as a leader, it's unavoidable to, at some point, having to play this role. I have spent a few hours already working with this, and probably I will spend some more time. But and actually the reason why I don't mind spending this amount of time and doing these kind of things is it connects to the final principle. And it's like, I do have fun doing these kind of things. It's something that I really enjoy. As a leader, I believe this is one of the most important principles and one of the most important things that as a leader, if as a leader you don't enjoy what you're doing, whether it is being the bad guy in some cases, whether it is reacting to unforeseen circumstances, there might be days in which you don't know how to keep things moving. Ultimately, even as a dungeon master, in which there are some sessions in which things are very slow, the conversation doesn't flow, things are dragging, people seem to not having a good time, still being able to enjoy, recover, plan the next session, and as long as your players keep coming to your game table every day, being able to enjoy these kind of legs of the journey is key. And this is, in my opinion, or in my experience, is equally true whether I'm preparing a long campaign that is going to last for 2 years, or I'm going to be working on a heavy migration that at some point throughout the time is going to be released. But having fun, enjoying every single step of the journey is key.
なるほど、勉強になりました。ところで、ゲームはどんな感じですか？できましたか？
So we have spent some more hours changing things here and there. Now the game looks different. I also add like an intro to explain a little bit of more of the world, not just jumping into the conversation. Did you have fun?
もちろん、この短い時間ですごい出来ですね。
So yeah, I hope that you like building the game and you find these 7 principles interesting. But remember, leadership is not a title, it's an action. Whether you are creating a world for your players to have a good time or you are actually managing a large project, the important part as a leader is to make sure that you give room to a new set of heroes to explore the world or to be delivering value to your customers. It's all about making things count, whether it's on the game table or in your daily work life. All right, thank you for joining me in this adventure. Now it's time to create your own story.